So James chapter 1, the first 8 verses. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into different temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have a perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like the wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Amen.
Thank you, Phil. Okay. Well, this morning we looked a bit about this James who wrote this letter and who he was. It's generally accepted that he was the half-brother of Jesus. And we also look at who he was writing to. And that's the Jews who had become Christians, who were scattered because of persecution and because of the difficulties they were having in Jerusalem. We looked at one of the key themes of the book, which is living faith. And we looked at the contrast between having a living faith and a dead faith. And a living faith produces fruit, it produces good works, and virtues that make us like the Lord. This evening I want to look at what I think is the second biggest, most important message of the book, and that's James speaks about patience. And that word patience, it might be translated differently in the version you have. Sometimes it's translated endurance, sometimes perseverance, sometimes steadfastness. Personally, I like patience more. It's a more spiritual word to me. The baddies of this world can often have endurance and perseverance. But if someone is patient, it's almost always a positive trait, isn't it? We have the saying, patience is a virtue. All the people I think of when I think of patient people, they're lovely people. Calm, willing to wait, self-controlled, slow to anger, meek, all things that we consider to be positive. A definition of patience, if you looked it up, is to be able to wait for something without getting frustrated. Being able to wait without being frustrated. And wouldn't we all want to be a bit more patient? I've been told I'm patient, and I suppose I can be. But sometimes I'm hungry. Sometimes I'm tired. There's limits to our patience, isn't there? And I'll be honest with you, times when I've lost my patience, I've done things that I've deeply regretted, things that I probably never forget. We don't want to lose our patience. We don't want to be out of control, do we? And James starts this letter with a bold, shocking statement that we should count it all joy when we fall into various trials, because the testing of our faith produces patience. We might admire patience. We might see it in others and really want it for ourselves. But do we see it with having that much value that we're glad to face new trials because it will help us to be more patient? Do we ever see patience as being that much of value that is worth going through trials and testings and difficulties to get it? Do we want our faith to be pushed to its limits so that it can be tested? Well, faith and patience go together. You can't be one without the other. You need a strong faith to be patient. And it's only when our patience is tested, it's only when our faith is tested that we see how strong it is. If you've just put a new roof on your house, it's only when you have a real hard storm that you find out if it's going to fall off or not, isn't it? But once you've been through that storm, you know it has endurance. You know it's going to last the next storm, and you have a greater faith. Your faith is tested, but then it's greater for it. I have a little illustration, and like with all illustrations, they're never perfect. But who can tell me what this is? Any of the children can see this? What's this, Hannah? Samuel, what's that? Can you tell me? Hannah, do you know what this is? She might have seen it before.
It's a screwdriver.
It's a screwdriver, yeah. Now this is something I made in school before I finished school. I finished school at 15, so I was probably 13, 14 when I made this. And bear with me, have patience. This is a mild steel shaft, nothing special, just ordinary steel. The handle is made of aluminium. And we took this shaft, put it in a mould, and poured molten aluminium on it to make a handle, and then span it in a lathe and turned a nice pattern into it to hold it in your hand. And then this end, that was the easy bit. This end needed to be made into the right shape. And we got it very hot in a furnace, red hot, and hit it with a hammer to squash it and to make it flat, to make the end the right shape. Then, after it was in the right shape and we'd filed it and got it just right, we heated it up again, very hot, and then put it in very cold water. And it made a huge cloud of smoke when you do that. Big noise, lots of smoke, and being 13, it's really cool. Then, you might hit it a bit more and shape it a bit more. You heat it up again, and then you let it cool very gradually. And then our teacher got us to repeat the whole thing over and over and over again until the lesson finished. And I don't know how much of that was him just making us use up the time or how much of it really helped. But that process was to make it harder, to make it stronger. Mild steel is a soft, bendy metal. And to make it to be able to put it in a screw and put all that force on it, it needs to be harder. To be a useful tool, it needs to be hardened. And it's not a pleasant thing to be hardened. Hitting it with a hammer makes it harder. Putting it through rollers and squashing steel makes it harder. Getting it very hot and then suddenly cooling it down, shocking it like that, makes it harder. Not a pleasant process for the metal, is it? And then when metal gets very hard, it's like glass. You can't scratch glass. It's a very, very hard substance. And it's perfect for making, if you were making a razor blade, if you were making a very sharp blade, you'd want it to be as hard as can be so that it stays sharp. But for a screwdriver, you don't want it to be that hard. You don't want it to be like glass because it would shatter. When you put a bit of force on it, it would just break off. So you do something called tempering. You'd heat it up very hot, and then you'd let it cool down very gradually. For me, I just left it in the air and let it cool down for, 20 minutes. But if I was in a company making the best tools, I'd put it in an oven and I'd slowly reduce the temperature and temper it. And what tempering does is it puts a bit of spring into the metal, a bit of give. It means it can bend without breaking. So it's hardened and then it's tempered. And as I said, neither of those processes are pleasant, but they're necessary for it to be a tool that's worth something. And this tool has been abused. I've used it lots. Opening paint tins and things like that, you're not supposed to do with a screwdriver. If you look at this end, it's flat because I've hit it with a hammer. Lots of things you shouldn't do, but it's survived because of that process, because it's been through those trials. It can survive, it can last the course. Maybe, I don't know, I'll pass this on to Hannah and she'll carry on using it. Who knows? She does like tools. Let's have a look, see where we are. The hardening process gives it strength. But we also need to be tempered, that we have that special combination of strength and, the word I'm going to make up, springiness. And that special combination, the two things together, gives us patience. Because patience isn't just being strong. And when we apply these principles to ourselves, trials can make us tougher, stronger, more resilient. But we also need to be tempered with love, tempered with grace. It's no good just being hard, is it? We need to be able to bend a little when it's needed. It's been mentioned in the studies that we've been doing on a Tuesday. We've been working our way through Isaiah and looking at all the judgments that God gave to his people. But how many times has it come up that Neil has said and Martin has said, the judgment was tempered with grace? You see, that's where that word comes from, tempering. It's not just one thing, it's a little bit of another. Tempered with grace. And God's judgments are tempered with grace. As I said, neither of the processes are pleasant, to be hardened or the tempering. But it's impossible to have a useful tool without these. There used to be a shop in Cardiff called Hyper Value. I don't know if anybody you remember that. It was one of my favourite places to go. My grandpa introduced it to me because he loved a bargain. And it was one of the places I used to go into Cardiff by myself on the train as a boy and spend my pocket money on things. And I'd quite often be amazed that you could buy a whole set of screwdrivers or a whole set of spanners for a couple of pounds. Brilliant. They looked fantastic until you tried to use them. And they wouldn't last one job. They weren't suitable for one screw. So what's the point? You know, you've got spanners, yeah. Good girl. Okay. We want to be useful, don't we? Have you ever thought of yourself as a tool in God's hand? Somebody that God can use? That you can play a part in his plans, his purposes? You've got a screwdriver? Yeah, well done, Hannah. James 1-4. James 1 verse 4. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. And I said this morning when the word perfect came up, it can be translated something different. And in this case, mature. Let patience have its perfect work, that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. Again, I think we can understand how important this inner strength... Can we understand how important this inner strength is? We need to be mature. Mature Christians, complete and without lacking, if we want to be what God wants us to be. It goes on in James chapter 5. He comes back to this subject of patience. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You've heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. James mentions Job as an example of patience. And the hardest thing for Job was that he didn't have the privilege we have of seeing that conversation that God had about him to the devil. He wasn't there. He didn't know. He didn't know the Lord thought so much of him. He didn't know the purpose of all of this was that so that he would glorify the Lord. It's the same for us. The hardest thing in any trial is seeing the Lord in it. Once we can believe that the Lord has a purpose in that trial, that he's in control, the worst of the trial is over. Just in understanding that, just in being able to see that the Lord is in control and that he has a purpose. And is this why James so suddenly switches to the subject in verse 5 of wisdom? He's speaking about patience, and then suddenly it seems so random, doesn't it? It seems so strange that he suddenly flicks. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. We need that wisdom sometimes to see that the Lord is behind things, that the Lord is in control. If we looked at the life of Job, if we looked in Job 23 and verse 10, he says, I know, but he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. So Job is in the middle of his difficulties, his trials. And really, if you read the book of Job, it's a very depressing book. Because trial after trial after trial, the people he loves are taken away from him. So many difficulties he has with his flesh. So many temptations come his way, his friends telling him to curse God and to die. It's such a grim story. It's really hard going. But these are the words of Job in the middle of those trials. But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. Isn't it amazing that Job had the faith to trust in a good outcome? He compares himself to gold, which must be refined. Again, not a pleasant process. If you know about how gold is refined, it has to be heated up until it's melted and the impurities removed. But the result is purity. Gold is a pure metal, and that's what makes it valuable. That's what makes it precious. Now, I want to be careful here, of course, talking about trials. I don't want to sound flippant, because I know some brothers and sisters in the Lord have gone through some terrible, difficult trials. And I wouldn't compare my trials to theirs. I wouldn't even compare the worst of my trials to some of the things some I've known to have to suffer. And I also want to say that not everything the bad that happens to us is from God. It's not the right attitude, I don't think. You know, things happen in life to good people and bad people. And, James also warns about the enemy trying to tempt us. We're tested by God. We're tempted by the enemy and led away by him and our own evil desires. But back to James, the book of James. Oh. One thing I meant to say is that James spoke of Job's patience. But a character that came to me as soon as I was thinking about patience and who's patient in the Bible, David, is a character that over and over again you see him showing incredible patience. And if you look in 1 Samuel 24, there's a story there where Saul is pursuing him, wanting him dead. And David was on the run for years. People estimate it between 8 and 12 years probably that Saul was after David all the time, trying to kill him. His men were after him. They had to keep moving. And it was a terrible existence. It was really difficult for David. And like I say, probably about 10 years this went on. And there came an opportunity for David. He was in a cave, and Saul came in to relieve himself in the cave. And David's men said, there he is, get him, you can get him. This could be the end of all of your problems. And David didn't kill him. Could have. But instead he cut the corner off his robe so that he could approach Saul later and say, I was in that cave. I could have killed you, but I didn't. And I don't believe it's God's timing, basically. And you know the effect that had on Saul. Let's have a look at it. 1 Samuel chapter 24. Let's pick it up at verse 6. And David said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David restrained his servants with these words, and did not allow them to rise against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went his way. David also arose afterwards, went out of the cave, and called out to Saul, saying, My lord the king. And when Saul looked at him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. And David said to Saul, Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Indeed, David seeks your harm? Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you today into my hand in the cave. And someone urged me to kill you, but my eyes spared you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see, this is the corner of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, know and see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and I have not sinned against you. Yet you hunt for my life to take it. Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dead dog? A flea? Therefore let the Lord be the judge, and judge between you and me, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of your hand. So it was when David had finished speaking these words to Saul, that Saul said, Is that your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. Then he said to David, You are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil. And you have shown this day how you have dealt with me. For when the Lord delivered me into your hand, and you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safely? Therefore may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. His actions, his patience with Saul. It brought Saul to tears, moved him, a hardened man, a man full of hate, a man who wanted to see him dead. The situation was completely changed by the patience that David showed that day. Well, back to James chapter 5 and verse 7. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth. A farmer without patience would be pretty useless at his job, wouldn't he? He'd plant something, wait a week, nothing's happened, dig it up, plant something else, wait a week, there's nothing coming. You can't be a farmer without having patience, can you? See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth. We've been commissioned to tend the Lord's vineyard, to be labourers in his fields. And the Lord's work can be slow. The results may not be quick. He needs us to be patient. And we have a capacity to be patient because God is patient and we're made in his image. Can you say that the Lord has been patient with you? I can. The Lord's been incredibly patient with me. One of the phrases used to describe the Lord often in the scriptures is that he's long-suffering. And the literal translation of that is slow to boil. He's slow to boil. The amount of times that a man would have lost his temper with me, God thankfully hasn't, because he's slow to boil. Psalm 76 and verse 38 tells us, many a time he turned away his anger and did not stir up his wrath. Many times he turned away his anger and did not stir up his wrath. And finally, talking about the Lord's patience, in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9, it tells us that the Lord is not willing that any should perish. The actual wait for him returning. We're waiting for the day the Lord returns, but the delay is because that he's not willing that any should perish. It's his patience that means that we're here today. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 25, if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with perseverance. The context in Romans 8 is the eagerness that we feel for that day when we will be delivered from the bondage of corruption, our human body. It's speaking of the day when we will see him and we will be like him. A glorious day, a day when a lot of battles will be over, battles against the flesh. But it says here, we hope for what we do not see, eagerly waiting for it with perseverance. You can be patient and you can still have that eagerness in your heart for that day. It's right that we should look forward to that day, but we should wait for it with patience, with perseverance. We shouldn't be like the farmer I mentioned, impatiently digging up his crops and trying something else. The Lord doesn't want us to break. I talked about a tool. If you go and buy a tool, you don't want it to break, do you? You want it to last the course. The Lord doesn't want us to break. Not just because he wants to get the job done, that he's using us, that we're playing our part in, but because he wants us to last the course, to finish the race. May we never forget that the Lord's ultimate plan and purpose in everything that he's done is that we should finish the course and be with him forever. That's why we need endurance. That's why we need patience. We don't try something different when it gets tough. We stick with it because we know the outcome. We know what we're heading for. We know who's paid the price for our lives. We know who's redeemed us. We know who's sat on the throne in heaven. And all of these things give us patience, endurance, to see it through. Well, I trust that's been a help. I enjoy looking at the subject of patience. I think it's a beautiful virtue, isn't it? Patience, and it's only the Lord that can do that work within our hearts. Amen.